British policy in the Palestine Mandate. The British understood that they had created a real problem in Palestine by, in a sense, promising both people, Jews and Palestinians, a nation. This confusion on the part of the British was apparent in their policy as the mandate advanced. And we can follow that confusion in the issuance and the policies laid out by the British in what were called white papers. White papers were simply policy statements issued by Whitehall, the Foreign Office of the British Empire, over the course of the British Mandate. The first white paper was issued in 1922, and it followed the 1921 Jaffa riot, in which Arabs killed a bunch of Jews. It was meant to lay down and to make clear what the Balfour Declaration meant, and to clarify to Palestinians that Jews in Palestine were there by right, not sufferance. That was the essential declaration of the 1922 White Paper. It declared that immigration of Jews to Palestine was not to exceed the economic absorptive capacity. Now, this diplomatic phrase, which was meant to allay the fears of the Palestinians that they would be swamped with Jewish immigration, was very ambiguous, because what did economic absorptive capacity mean? The Jews argued there is a big difference between the Jewish economy and the Palestinian economy. They said, we're building kibbutz, we're building labor unions purely for Jews, and we can absorb tons of Jews. The Palestinians, who suffer for high unemployment rates, have their own economic problems, but that should not affect the absorptive capacity of the Jewish community. The Palestinians said, absolutely wrong. This is discriminatory. Palestinians should be able to work on Jewish farms, in Jewish labor unions, and so forth, and you have to take the absorptive economic capacity of the entire population of Palestine. So if there's high rates of unemployment amongst Palestinians, that means that Jews cannot come or immigrate to Palestine. This debate amongst Palestinians and Jews about what the meaning of the Balfour Declaration was and what the purpose of the mandate was would never go away. The second major white paper, the 1930 Passfield White Paper, was issued following the 1929 Wailing Wall and Hebron incidents, in which the two communities again had flared up in violence. The Passfield White Paper called for a halt to Jewish immigration. Government land was to be sold only to Arabs, and the economic absorptive capacity was to include Arab unemployment. Now, this white paper was seen by the Yishuv and by Jews around the world to be highly prejudicial against them and to undermine the very meaning of the Balfour Declaration. They screamed bloody murder, and by 1931, just a year later, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald countermanded the Passfield White Paper, which in turn infuriated the Arabs. Immigration shot up from 1933 to 36 when Hitler came to power. 165,000 Jews came to Palestine during those 3 short years. The idea of forming a Palestinian Legislative Council and a constitution was rejected by both sides. The outbreak of the Arab Revolt in 1936 and its continuation until 1939, 3 long years of warfare, changed the policy of the British. Arabs mobilized throughout Palestine began attacking the British. The British put it down violently, wounding or killing about 20,000 Arabs. It was a devastating experience for the Palestinian community. Their leadership was sent into exile, their military organizations defeated, and their society fragmented. But it forced the British to think about how they were going to deal with Palestine as they saw war on the horizon and the growth of Hitler's power in Germany. The British had moved over 100,000 troops to Palestine in order to pacify this Arab revolt. They needed to get those 100,000 back to Europe in order to fight Hitler. And that meant pacifying the Arabs. The Arab Revolt of 1936 was contemporaneous with the Peel Commission, which was sent to Palestine to find a solution to this problem. The Peel Commission was novel because it suggested the partition of Palestine into two different states: a large Arab state linked to Transjordan and a smaller Jewish state. The second and more radical proposal was the transfer of about 225,000 Palestinian Arabs from the Jewish state to the Arab state. This proposal was rejected by the Arab Higher Committee and revisionist Zionists alike. The Zionists were confused about it because it was a small Jewish state that didn't match their ambitions, but the Arabs were completely opposed. The notion that many would have to give up their homes and that the Jews would get a state in what they saw as a Palestinian majority country infuriated them. The Great Revolt of 1936 to 39 was fought in part over these questions of what the future of Palestine would be. In order to bring an end to the 1936 Arab Revolt, the British issued what's been called the 1939 White Paper. It set out the parameters for a unified state. It was going to keep Palestine as one country. It declared that only 75,000 immigrants could come to Palestine over the next 5 years. That means about 15,000 a year. Jews were not to exceed 1/3 of the total population of Palestine. There would be no Arab land sales to Jews. These were the basic principles of the 1939 White Paper. The Jewish community was infuriated, as you can imagine, at a time when Hitler was leading Europe into war and beginning, or about to begin, the final solution. This was the last thing Jews wanted to hear. They believed it was a stab in the back by the British. At the same time, the British turned to the Jews and said, "You have to support us. I know this is a bitter pill to swallow, but we are trying to fight Hitler. We need all of our troops in Britain to fight Hitler. Hitler is your enemy, your number one enemy. You have to help us fight Hitler. In order to do that, you have to allow us to bring our troops out of Palestine, and that means placating the Palestinians." For the 5 years of World War II, the 1939 White Paper held sway. The Palestinians did not fight against the British, and neither did the Jews. But this policy was again turned upside down at the end of the war by none other than the United States. President Truman, who began to gear up his presidential campaign in 1946 for the 48 elections, laid down that he would encourage the immediate movement of 100,000 Jews from Europe to Palestine. We have to remember that over 6 million Jews were killed in Europe during the war. 200,000 Jews remained in camps where they needed to be relocated. This problem of displaced peoples weighed heavily on the United States. Also, the U.S. was discovering only in 1945 the extent of the final solution. Life magazine published pictures of the concentration camps with heaps of Jewish bodies piled up. The world realized they needed to do something for the Jews. And this led Truman to issue his platform that 100,000 Jews would be taken immediately to Palestine and that 200,000 would go over time. You can imagine the British, who had promised not to have more than 15,000 Jewish immigrants a year for 5 years, were incensed by this. They turned to Washington and Truman and said, "You can't do this. We're in charge of the British mandate, and you cannot make the policy of immigration for Palestine." Truman, determined to win the election, dismissed British concerns. The policy by the United States to encourage Jewish immigration once again to Palestine was the direct cause for the British turning over the Palestinian mandate and responsibility for it to the United Nations. As you recall, the United Nations had been just formed in 1945 by Truman in San Francisco as a way to adjudicate world problems and avoid war. The British realized with America making policy for Palestine, they could not control what would be an inevitable war between the Jewish Yishuv and the Palestinian population over control of land, population, immigration. They tried to get rid of the mandate as quickly as they could, and this meant that it got put onto the laps of the United Nations. As we see, British policy and the mandate switched back and forth, at times pro-Yishuv, at other times pro-Palestinian. The British could never find the right compromise, perhaps because there was no right compromise, and because historical events overtook the British. The rise of Hitler, the destruction of European Jews, meant that they needed to find another home. The Americans didn't want them, and most of the world would not let them in. And this meant that Europe ultimately directed them towards Palestine. In this way, what has been called the Jewish problem in Europe was turned into a Middle Eastern problem. And it laid down the foundations for a whole series of wars, which we've come to know as the Arab-Israeli conflict.